Good evening. My name's Helen Withicombe and I'm the Head of Programming here at the Wheeler Centre. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that we are gathered today on the traditional lands of the Bunurong and Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. This always was and always will be Aboriginal land. Thank you for joining us for tonight's important lecture from the Director of the Refugee Program for Human Rights Watch, Bill Frelick. In his current role, Bill monitors, investigates and documents human rights abuses against refugees and asylum seekers and advocates for the rights and humanitarian needs of all forcibly displaced people around the world. Before joining Human Rights Watch, Bill directed Amnesty International's refugee program, as well as the US Committee for Refugees, on which he served for 18 years. He has travelled to refugee sites around the world and is widely published. Tonight, Bill will provide a snapshot of the state of the world's refugees in 2018, exploring regional responses, rhetoric versus reality, and the myths and facts of deterrence. At the end of the lecture, Bill will be taking questions from the audience, so please have them ready. Please join me in welcoming Bill to the stage.
Well, thank you very much, everybody. I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you and have enjoyed my first visit to Australia, and Melbourne being my first stop has been delightful. I've enjoyed getting to become acquainted with your city, and it's been really very nice, including a couple hours ago walking down the street and seeing a big demonstration coming my way saying refugees welcome. So. It was very heartening to see, especially since, who knows, it could have been just the opposite. So it's nice to have such a welcoming message, and seeing St. Paul's Cathedral with the big refugees welcome banner as well as something that I greatly appreciate coming here. What I want to do today is to talk about 6 barriers to asylum. These are not 6 distinct barriers, these are interlocking barriers. Some of them will be very familiar to you, will resonate, and you'll recognize that you'll see Australia. I may not mention it explicitly at every point, but these barriers are significant, and they really are preventing many people today in the year 2018 who need protection from getting protection. So let's look at the first one, the first of these 6. And that is, you are not a refugee. Perhaps it's you are an economic migrant. And there the question really becomes, does that forfeit your claim to being a refugee just because you're poor? Might you still not have a well-founded fear of being persecuted? A poor person could be persecuted every much as bit as a rich one. But it goes beyond that. The 1951 Refugee Convention is, in some respects, an antiquated definition of who a refugee is. It talks about a person as a refugee is someone that has a well-founded fear of being persecuted on one of 5 grounds: race, religion, nationality, membership in a particular social group, or political opinion. There's no mention in the Refugee Convention of war, of conflict, of indiscriminate violence, and certainly no mention of forced displacement as a result of the effects of natural disasters, or human-made disasters for that matter. And so when we look at the world today, as we all recognize it and we understand the drivers, the causes of forced migration, we recognize that the legal framework that we have to respond, to provide protection to people, is not exactly adequate to meet the task. And on top of that, while there has been, over the course of the years since 1951, a sort of progressive interpretation of who is included under the Refugee Convention, so that in Africa, under the OAU Convention, there's a broader refugee definition. The Cartagena Declaration in the Americas similarly broadens the refugee definition. And in the European Union, the Qualification Directive has something called subsidiary protection, often known as complementary protection, that recognizes people fleeing indiscriminate violence as a result of armed conflict. But when you look at the United States, when you look at Australia, when you look at other jurisdictions, the definition is still very narrowly applied to people that meet that convention definition. And this is used to exclude people. In my country, in the United States, just recently, until very recently, Attorney General Jeff Sessions recently put forward a decision that imposes on our immigration courts, which are within his Department of Justice, an interpretation called Matter of AB, that basically says that the Central Americans who are fleeing gang violence or domestic violence in their countries, when their own governments are not able or willing to protect them, and they have no other options but to flee their country, are not to be considered as refugees under the Refugee Convention. That the private actors don't count, basically. And so here you have people under existential threat that are being told, you are not a refugee. Barrier number 2. You are a refugee, but you should have found protection somewhere else. All right? Perhaps inside your own country. You should search every corner of your country to basically see if there's some place you could have gone to found protection before you came here. And if you are here, we're going to search that same country to see whether there's some place we can return you. So we're recognizing that you have a well-founded fear of being persecuted in Kandahar. But maybe we can return you to Kabul, and you can join the hundreds of thousands of internally displaced people who are there, and we'll just add one more, to the IDP rolls, and you can manage there. Good luck. So we recognize you as a refugee, but we're going to deny asylum to you because you could have found protection somewhere in some corner of your home country. Or say that's not an option. We will talk about a safe third country. All right? You are coming from Central America. You went through Mexico. Why are you coming to the United States? We can return you to Mexico, safe third country. What's wrong with Mexico? Well, what's wrong with Mexico is this. Many of the gangs that are threatening people's lives have reaches that actually extend into Mexico, or other gangs that will prey upon the people that are seeking protection there. Or you have, even though the law on paper in Mexico looks very good, the Cartagena Declaration I mentioned before is a more liberal refugee definition than the one in the United States. However, the gap between what's written in the law and how it is executed on the ground is, completely different. You have endemic corruption, you have police that are blocking access to the asylum system, and you have a completely under-resourced asylum system where you have 40 adjudicators in the entire country that are qualified, that are able to make a refugee status determination. And so there's a bottleneck there immediately. And then you have countries, and there's a deal, you may have heard of it, the deal, the EU-Turkey deal, whereby the European Union essentially is declaring that Turkey is a safe third country for refugees coming from Syria and other places. What they fail to mention is that Turkey's accession to the Refugee Convention, that 1951 convention, maintains a geographical limitation that excludes refugees that come from places other than Europe. So Syrian refugees, by definition, cannot be recognized as refugees in Turkey. And on top of that, as Human Rights Watch has documented, new arrivals, if they can get into Turkey, are not being registered by the authorities and don't have the opportunity of being protected. And on top of that, the authorities have actually closed their border with Syria, and we've documented border guards shooting asylum seekers, pushing them back, and deporting people who they've refused to register, deporting them as illegal immigrants that are in Turkey, when in fact they are refugees fleeing persecution and conflict in Syria. So these are the kinds of safe third countries that people are transiting through in order to try to get a protection, a more secure protection than they can in these transit countries or countries of first arrival. But then you have Australia and Israel, which has sort of developed this safe third country concept and then sort of turned it on its head, because the idea was that you transited through these countries, and why didn't you apply for asylum if you're a refugee and not just an economic migrant? Why didn't you apply at the first chance you had? But Nauru and Papua New Guinea are not places that people transited through to get to Australia. Israel sending people to Rwanda, sending Eritreans and Sudanese to Rwanda and Uganda, these are countries that they've never set foot in, and where there are no assurances at all that they will have a consideration of their refugee claims. And so they're really left stranded in these so-called safe third countries, and they're really not safe. And what you end up seeing is, in the cases of Nauru and Manus Island, refugees, I think there have been 6 cases of suicide, people, Nauru Island, being the same size as the Melbourne airport for people that are there for 5 years and counting, that have not had the opportunity to go on with their lives and to fully be protected. So we've looked at, you are not a refugee, you are a refugee, but you should have found protection somewhere else. How about you're a refugee, but wait your turn? All right? Now, refugees are fleeing chaos. They're fleeing threats to their lives. They're fleeing violence and war. And yet, there's this mentality on the part of receiving states that, take a ticket, there's a queue there, get at the end of the line, wait your turn, and, be well-mannered. Human Rights Watch did a report on Australia in 2002, 16 years ago. The title of that report was By Invitation Only.
Shame on us.
Well, think about it. Basically saying that the good refugees are the refugees that are invited here, and the bad refugees, the ones that are not waiting their turn, that will be irregular maritime migrants, are those that will jump the queue. And so we hear these references to breaking the business model of the smugglers, and yet what the governments have done, and it's not just Australia, they've created bottlenecks intentionally to create long, long waits where people who are desperate don't have the luxury of waiting in line. If your life is being threatened, you can't simply wait around for years and years and years of time for your number to come up. Refugees are not just regular immigrants. Refugees are people who need protection. And therefore, oftentimes it is chaotic. And it's very difficult to bring order to such chaos. Now, there are many things that you can do to provide order, to do screening for security, which is a very important thing, to actually make refugee status determinations. But you have to do it in a way that is efficient, that's fair, and that gives people a real opportunity that are in danger to get a foothold, to get some sort of temporary protection at least, while their claims are pending and while you're sorting out who are the ones that will need a more permanent or a longer term form of protection. Waiting your turn is also, in some respects, setting the refugees who are being resettled, that is, they're being interviewed, oftentimes a long, slow process overseas, usually from camps that have protracted, where people have been living there for years and years and years, so they're not under a sort of a direct threat. And they are the people that are the candidates for resettlement, the ones that get invited to come to Australia, Canada, the United States, and other places. That's perfectly fine. That's a perfectly good thing to do. But to set those refugees that are resettled off against people that are asylum seekers, that are coming saying, I'm a refugee, I need to be protected, I need help, is in some sense robbing Peter to pay Paul. And Australia specifically has a single budget for their special humanitarian visas, where any person who on shore is granted asylum, a person that comes by an airplane or whatever, overstays a visa, says, don't send me home, if that person's granted asylum here, then essentially one place is taken away from the refugees that would be resettled. All right, so one's being pitted against the other. It's the only jurisdiction I know of in the world that does that. every other place that I'm aware of basically says the asylum process is a legal process. We have obligations under the Refugee Convention, under customary international law, to make sure that we're not committing refoulement. That is the foundational principle of refugee law, that you don't return a refugee to a place where their life or freedom would be threatened. And so that's a legal process. Whereas refugee resettlement is essentially a political process. You can pick and choose. You can budget the number of refugees that you want to bring. You can decide the refugees that are of particular concern to your country. And you can decide that these are the refugees we choose to help, that we want to invite to come into our country to join us and to help. Perfectly fine, but it's discretionary. It's not mandatory. There's no right of resettlement, but there is a right not to be returned to persecution. So discretionary who we want to pull out of the fire, basically, and bring here, but we have an obligation not to send someone back into the fire, to make sure that the claims are examined carefully before we send someone back. That's the asylum process, different from the resettlement process. But what we're hearing time and time again is that refugees should wait their turn. And in the EU-Turkey deal specifically, the deal itself explicitly sets out that if a Syrian refugee hops on a boat and goes to Greece, that refugee will be returned to Turkey and put at the very end of the queue for resettlement. Whereas the refugee that sat there calmly with their hands folded like this, that refugee that didn't try to seek asylum, that didn't try to get to Greece by boat, that refugee will be then put at the front of the queue, basically. Well, when you think about it, you think about who are people, why do people get on boats? Why do people put their children on boats? Why do you have the risk that you would take to do that if there isn't something that is pushing you to do it? And it may be that a Syrian Kurd in Turkey, with the very difficult relations between the Kurds and the Turks, would have a very different view than a Syrian refugee that maybe doesn't have a Kurdish background. But that isn't taken into account at all. It's simply looking like widgets on a factory line, and basically interchangeable that, we're going to punish you for seeking protection sooner and put you at the end of the queue, and this one that was well-mannered and well-behaved gets the preference, regardless of their vulnerability, regardless of the reasons that they may have had for jumping on that boat. The notion then of orderliness we're seeing just recently on the US-Mexico border as well, where the US has declared that you can only file an asylum claim at ports of entry, that if you cross the border at some other place, you will not be allowed to file an asylum claim. The Refugee Convention is very clear that any refugee can apply for asylum, at any point. There's nothing that specifies a port of entry. And in fact, US law is explicit in saying that irrespective of status, anywhere, and it even says explicitly, not at ports, not at ports of entry, you can apply for asylum in the United States. It's Section 208 of the Immigration and Nationality Act. And yet by regulation and proclamation, President Trump has said that he can essentially overturn the law. Well, you need a law to overturn another law. You need a constitutional amendment to overturn a constitutional amendment. It can't just be done in that way. But beyond that, essentially what you're looking at and what we're seeing on the border right now is the creation of these bottlenecks. And at ports of entry in the United States as we speak, there are congregating Central American asylum seekers that want to apply for asylum. They want to lodge a claim. It's not that they are trying to evade inspection. It's not that they're trying to get past the border guards and sneak into the country. They want to seek asylum. And yet they're being denied that opportunity. They're being turned away, saying, we can't accommodate you today. We can only take 2 or 3 here, 2 or 3 there. And the bottleneck is such that as more and more people are coming in, the waits are getting longer and longer. And the criminals and the corrupt police and others that prey upon the refugees and asylum seekers in Mexico are having a field day with people that are stuck on the US-Mexico border. All right, so we've had you are not a refugee. We've had you are a refugee, but you should have found protection somewhere else. We have you are a refugee, but wait your turn. Now we have you may be a refugee, but you might also be a terrorist. All right? This is one, it strikes a chord. It's something where people are afraid, and certain politicians, example in my own country, have made quite a bit of political capital on conflating refugees with terrorists and suggesting that there may be a poisoned, in the bowl of candy, what are called Skittles in my country, that there may be a poisoned Skittle there. That was a specific image used by Trump in the last election. So let's look at this and see the way it plays out. It plays out not just in the industrial West, if you want to call it. I don't know how Australia figures into that. I'm not sure the nomenclature to use for the countries with fully developed asylum systems. But we actually see it playing out in many other places as well. We've seen tens of thousands of Nigerian refugees in Cameroon in the past year that have been pushed back into Boko Haram controlled areas of Nigeria because of fear that some of them may in fact be Boko Haram. And the logic of this gets really weird because you're talking about people fleeing Boko Haram. They're fleeing this extremist organization that goes into schools and kills teachers and kidnaps girls, and they're fleeing that, and yet because there's some fear that there may be a terrorist lurking amongst them, they're being pushed back into the jaws of Boko Haram persecution. In Jordan, on the far, sort of the desert border with Syria, a place called Rukban, there's what's known as a berm. It's an earthen wall, basically. And refugees, about 50 to 80,000 refugees at various points in time, since the border with Jordan and Syria was closed in June 2016. It was closed because ISIS waged an attack on a border post and killed some Jordanian border guards. At that point, Jordan said, no more. We're not taking any more Syrian refugees. And the Syrian refugees that were fleeing from ISIS were left stranded in this godforsaken place called the berm. So, and those people, by the way, are still there today. Okay, maybe 50,000 asylum seekers that have the right to seek asylum. They're being rejected at the frontier, and they are at very high risk of their lives, basically. And the debate, I mean, Human Rights Watch has basically said what I've just said, that they have the right to seek asylum. You need to sort out if there are terrorist elements or elements of people that are seeking to do harm to Jordan, then, interview people, screen people, do your diligence on that. But don't assume and don't tar everyone with that brush, because there are people there that need to be protected from the very thing that you're afraid of yourself. And the debate has actually ended up being one with many of my colleagues on the humanitarian side that I have a great deal of respect for, but it's all been about how do we feed and get water and medical care to the people that are stranded in this desert location. And about a year ago, after months of no assistance getting to the people that were stranded on the border at the berm, there was a great fanfare, and there were press releases, and there was celebration, because the agreement was to build a crane and to drop on pallets food on the other side of this earthen berm for people to then rush and, social Darwinian, who's the strongest one to go in and grab that food and feed themselves and their family. That was what people celebrated as an accomplishment under these circumstances. We see how sort of the goalpost has changed. So we've talked about Cameroon, we've talked about Jordan, but now let's talk about the United States, Australia, the European Union, how to deal with sorting out people who actually need protection with people who would do harm to our countries. And none of us want to be harmed. We all want to be safe. I'm well aware of the terror attacks that have occurred here in Australia, as I am of the attacks that have happened in my own country. But one of the things that we can look at, and what we have looked at, is the vetting procedures, and most of these cases, these are people that when they, and the overwhelming majority of refugees coming in are thoroughly vetted by the security services, by, in the case of the United States, every refugee that comes in goes through, vetting from the UN High Commissioner for Refugees first, a referral. The person doesn't choose to come to the United States. As I mentioned, it's the United States choosing that person to bring. You don't have your choice of resettlement country. You don't have a choice of where UNHCR will refer you. And then the process involves, additional layers of doing new refugee status determinations, plus more security screenings. In my country, it involves National Counterterrorism Center, the Department of Homeland Security, the FBI, and all the other acronyms that you can think of, basically, on the security side of the ledger. It's the most carefully vetted group of immigrants that come to the United States of any group, bar none. And yet, we have these incidents that happen, and the incidents that have happened here as well. But one of the things that strikes me in the cases that I'm familiar with, including the cases here in Australia, is many of the perpetrators of these horrible acts are people who came as children. In most of the cases that I've seen here in Australia, these are people that arrived in the early 1990s, people that were born in the 1980s. We have children that were basically babies when they arrived here. No amount of screening could have determined that this person 20 years, 25 years hence was going to attack people with a knife suddenly on a street a couple blocks away from here. And so we have to be somewhat realistic here. We have to look at, what is the good that we are trying to accomplish, and what are the risks in order to do that? Because there's nothing in this life that isn't 100% risk-free. When we decide of the good that we have from driving a car, we recognize that there are going to be accidents and some people are going to be killed. I don't want to minimize the threat, but I do want to say that it also shouldn't be exaggerated, it shouldn't be distorted, and it shouldn't be used in a way to manipulate fears to exclude people who do need protection. And to put our emphasis, as we think about this and want to actually address this problem, to put greater thought into what we need to integrate refugees, to actually make them welcome, to actually make them feel that they're part of the society that has hosted them and are not alienated from that society and ultimately won't turn on it. All right. So we've been through 4 of the barriers to asylum. You're not a refugee. You are a refugee, but you should have found protection somewhere else. You are a refugee, but you need to wait your turn. You might be a refugee, but you might also be a terrorist. Now we'll look at you are a refugee, but we've got problems of our own. All right, we have homeless people here. I've just, met a few of them on your lovely streets. And there are a lot of other countries that have, vastly more in terms of the scale of the problems, vastly greater problems of the challenge of integrating very large numbers of refugees with serious problems of their own. Take Lebanon, for example. Lebanon is a country of, roughly 4.5 million people. they had an influx of 1.1 million Syrian refugees. Lebanon, as many of you know, has a very delicate demographic balance. It doesn't have oil. It has had its own civil war. This is a country that the influx of more than 1 million Syrian refugees on top of the Palestinian refugees that are already there, and there's a number of Iraqi refugees and others that have been there for some time as well, is an enormous challenge to that country that they didn't ask for. Bangladesh, both Lebanon and Bangladesh, by the way, are places where I personally have done research in the last year and issued reports in both places. The report that I did, which was published in May on Lebanon, was about the expulsion of Syrian refugees from different municipalities. Basically, each municipality saying, we've got our hands full, we can't take any more. We can't push you out of the country, but we're evicting you from our municipality. And going through and rounding up Syrian refugees and pushing them out to somebody else's municipality, who in turn are pushing them out. And Syrians become basically ping-ponged or between the municipalities until perhaps they'll give up and just go home. The report that I did on Bangladesh is looking at the influx of more than 700,000 Rohingya refugees who were expelled in brutal ethnic cleansing from Myanmar in August and September of last year. Over a course of about 3 weeks, more than 700,000 people pouring into Bangladesh, a country that itself has a dense population, people that are unemployed, underemployed, a lack of space to put people, rising sea levels, and on and on. And yet, as I said before, there are obligations. None of these countries asked for refugees. No one asks for refugees, except maybe the few that are in a limited way, discretionarily, are resettled. The heavy lifting is overwhelmingly being done by third world countries, and that's something we need to remind Australia, the United States, and other well-to-do countries, that 85% plus of the world's refugees are basically in protracted refugee situations in Africa, in Asia, in the Middle East. They're not in Europe, they're not in North America, they're not in Australia overwhelmingly. And the burden is borne by those countries. And what has happened, what we saw with the secondary migration in 2015 that got so much publicity, was refugees that were in Turkey and in Lebanon that basically after 5 or 6 years there saw a dead end. Their children were not being allowed into school. They saw no future for their kids, and they saw no prospect that they would be able to go back to Syria anytime soon, and they decided to move on and seek a more permanent asylum in Europe. And the Europeans, of course, you know the reaction to that. It ended up being the EU-Turkey deal, among other efforts, and the rise of various xenophobic political parties that have basically said Europe for the Europeans. But what ends up getting lost in that shuffle is that those same rich countries have not provided the humanitarian support to the countries of first arrival that never asked to have refugees come into their countries in the first place, and are completely under-resourced in their ability to assist them. And so let's look at this year. I just checked the statistics this morning. So this is November 20th, 2018. We are almost at the end of the calendar year, 2018. So the UN appeals, the humanitarian appeals for these different refugee crises should be 92% funded. The refugee appeal for Syrian refugees in Lebanon, Jordan, and Turkey, and some in Iraq, some in Egypt, is 45% funded as of today. 45%, less than half of the funding this close to the end of the year. Now, that's a $5.6 billion appeal, but it's a $3 billion shortfall. And when you're in Lebanon, as I was recently, as I mentioned, and you see people that are being evicted from place to place, part of the reason they're being evicted is because they're not getting the international support that they need. And so the municipality says, we can't afford helping these people, and we're not getting any support from the rich countries, so we're going to push them out and let somebody else take care of the problem. We can't handle it. And they say that, and they say it very explicitly. Now, if you think things are bad for Syrian refugees, where at least the people in this room and people around the world are aware of their existence, let's look at some of the sub-Saharan refugee crises, okay? Look at South Sudan, okay? South Sudan with millions of internally displaced people, I think it's about 4 million at this point, had an appeal for about close to $1 billion to deal with that this year. That appeal is now 38% funded. And if you think that's bad, look at the Central African Republic, which again has one of the largest, I think it's close to 5 million refugees and IDPs combined. And that appeal, which is only for $500,000, okay, so we're talking about the Syrian appeal, $5.6 billion. The Central African Republic appeal is $500,000 for 6 million refugees and IDPs. That appeal, with it should be at least 92% funded at this point in the year, is 30% funded. All right? So the countries of first arrival, they have a case to make that, we are really stretched. But the reason they're really stretched is because the international community has failed in its shared responsibility to help them to make it possible to provide decent assistance for people to be able to live, to send their children to school, and to feel that they have any way to be able to live with dignity. But what really irks me is we're hearing the same squawking from the United States, from Australia, from the European Union, about, we can't handle this. The President of the United States talked about the caravan of Central Americans coming up as an invasion that somehow was going to overwhelm the United States, and he had to send troops, army troops to the border to protect the United States from this invasion, where you see, again, the interlocking of wait your turn, and you should have found protection in another place, and you're not really a refugee in the first place. Put them all together, you've got the Central Americans. But in addition to that, you have this notion somehow that the United States has its own homelessness problem, has its own problems, and we can't possibly accommodate, and we don't have the capacity to deal with such a challenging thing as maybe 10,000 refugees coming in, and that's the total number of the 3 caravans as we know it at the moment. Well, that's 5 of 6. The 6th barrier to asylum is you were a refugee, but things are great. Now it's time for you to go home. All right? We're seeing this in a number of places around the world. In 2016, Kenya announced that at that time the largest refugee camp in the world, the Dadaab refugee camp, with 300,000, 400,000 Somali refugees, had been there since the early 1990s. That basically, we've had it again. The UN humanitarian appeals have not been met, and it's time for you to go home. Things are better in Somalia. It's okay there. You can go back now. And basically what they did was this. They said, we're going to close the camp at the end of the year, at the end of 2016. It's going to be closed, and if you're not out of here by then, we're going to put you on trucks and send you back forcibly. But you have a window of opportunity. For the next 6 months, we'll give you $400 thanks to the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, and you'll sign a little form saying this is a voluntary return, it's voluntary repatriation, and we'll facilitate and help your return to Somalia. I did research there in Kenya at that time. I talked to people who actually took the money, went there, and found themselves getting shot at, found al-Shabaab still controlling 80% of the country, found drought and food insecurity, found that Mogadishu maybe had the central government controlled like a few city blocks, basically. And they realized, hey, there's nothing safe about this at all, and came back into Kenya, but they could no longer register as refugees because they had signed their voluntary repatriation. So they're now living back in the Dadaab camp, but without ration cards and without assistance, in a camp where you're not allowed to leave and you have no right to work. And we saw, incredibly, in 2016, the same thing happening in another place. And it turned out that this place had the largest forced refoulement, the forced return of refugees that we had seen in decades. Now, the entire world was looking at the European Union. They were looking at the Syrian refugees going there, and CNN and all the other broadcasters were looking at this. But what was happening, the real threat to refugee protection was happening to Afghan refugees in Pakistan. And in that year, in 2016, 600,000 Afghan refugees that had been living in Pakistan, some since the late 1970s, were forcibly returned to Pakistan. And it was the same model I just described to you in Kenya. It was even the same amount of money that was given. It was $400. They were told, registration is going to stop. You're not going to be able to re-register. You will no longer be considered refugees at the end of the year. And you have this opportunity to take the money. You're a poor person. $400 is a lot of money for an Afghan refugee or for a Somali refugee, and go back. But what we found, the same thing that we, in our research, Human Rights Watch, found, that the situation in Somalia was every bit as bad as it had been all the way along. Similarly, in Afghanistan, the rates of killing, the rates of violence were just as high, in some cases higher than they had been before. And so this flew in the face of the evidence on the ground of that it is safe to go back. It's great for refugees to go home if, in fact, the causes of your having been refugees have been addressed. And it's safe for you to go home, and you can return in safety and dignity and restoration of your rights. We all want that to happen. But to pretend that things are fine in Afghanistan or Somalia and that you can now go back is wishful thinking at best. And most recently, I mentioned that I was doing research this year in Bangladesh. We've seen just this week that the Bangladesh and Myanmar authorities had agreed that the first group of 2,000 Rohingya refugees would be returned, would be repatriated to Myanmar. Now, when I was there, I talked to the Bangladesh official, who is the official responsible for refugee repatriation. I said, how did you get this list of people? And he said, oh, we just took it from the registration rolls. The people who registered as refugees, we just picked those names. These were not people who came forward voluntarily. These were not people who said, I want to go back to Myanmar. These were people who were picked essentially at random. And their names were just put on the list. There's no informed consent. There's no choice here whatsoever. But just the idea that, okay, it's time to go back. Time to go back for Rohingya refugees? The ethnic cleansing, the burning of villages, the rape of women, the murder of Rohingya happened in August and September of 2017. We're hardly a year into this. And the chronic problems of statelessness, of rejecting the claims of Rohingya to citizenship and to their identity as Rohingyas, the justice for the crimes that have been committed against them, assurances that they will not be subjected to the same restrictions on their rights to move, their rights to work, even their rights to marry that have been imposed on them for years are not going to be imposed on them yet again. And we, again, in our research, Human Rights Watch, we actually saw the case of 6 Rohingya refugees that had fled in August, September last year. 3 men, 3 boys, who spontaneously went back. They wanted to check out their village. Is there anything left in the charred remains that we might be able to find? What about our crops? Is there something we might be able to harvest? Is there some opportunity, some chance that we may have to go back to our homeland? And what happened? They were arrested by Myanmar border guards, and they were charged with illegal entry, not as refugees, not as citizens of Myanmar that had lived there, had been born there, lived there their entire lives, but as illegal immigrants illegally coming into the country. They were brutally tortured, and I won't go into the details here, but you can read our extended press release that talks about in detail the tortures that they endured. And then they were brought before a kangaroo court, and on that charge of illegal entry, they were given 6-year prison sentences. Now, another kangaroo administrator saw an opportunity because there was a group of foreign journalists that were coming in on a tour, and so he pardoned them, and with guards, in the wings, trotted them out in front of the journalists, put a big smile on your face, and say how wonderful it is that you've come back, to the glorious wonders of life in Myanmar. They did it under that threat. And then at first opportunity, they fled back to Bangladesh again, which is where we talked to them and we documented what had happened to them and publicized it. And so what we were saying basically this past week, when the November 16th deadline for this repatriation was coming up, and we saw the deployment of Bangladesh army into the camps to make sure to control the movement of people, and buses that were ready, motors running to repatriate them, we basically did our full-blown advocacy to essentially say, this is what happens to people who have returned. And if Bangladesh, which did open up its borders and does deserve credit for that and didn't get the international support that it needs, if it turns around now and forcibly returns these people, all the goodwill that it has justifiably earned is going to be squandered. And thankfully, at the moment of truth, no refugees came forward, which we could easily have predicted, and the buses stood empty, and no repatriation occurred. So we've dodged a bullet this time around. It may happen again a few months from now. We'll have to wait and see what goes on. But basically, what we're seeing and the push that we're seeing in place after place is to basically say to refugees, when it's not safe to go home, that the welcome mat has grown thin. We've had enough. We don't have the international support we need, and you can make do back in your home country at this point. So as I said before, 6 barriers. I could probably come up with 4 or 5 more, but I only had 45 minutes to speak. But I think what you'll see, and maybe what you'll recognize here in Australia, is that this really forms a web of exclusion that is working to prevent people who need protection, who there but for the grace of God, or whatever you want to say, put yourself in their shoes, could happen to any one of us, all right? No one is immune from war. No one is immune from persecution. It can happen, all right? And it may not be happening now, but it could happen years from now. It may be, if you think back a generation or two to your family, it may have happened that brought you here in the first place. And so there's, I think, a need of all of us to look carefully at these barriers, to examine them in the way that I've just done for you today, and to look at, what are the real concerns, and how can we address those real concerns and solve them in ways that will make sure that our own countries are protected, our borders are protected, but at the same time that we are able to extend ourselves to either on a legal basis fulfill our legal obligations not to send people back to persecution, but even more than that, that we can, on a humanitarian level, and if it's not a legal requirement, that we can actually show a little generosity and a little welcome and a little understanding that there are people in this world that need to be protected, and we are the ones that will ensure whether they're protected or not. Thank you very much. I've run over a little. I think we've got about 13 minutes now for questions. So if you could keep your questions fairly brief, that would probably be best. I think there's someone with a microphone that could give you the opportunity to ask away. It's hard for me to see out there, so I've got the light shining in my eyes, but hopefully I'm not seeing any hands up. So, oh yeah, front row, somebody here. And there's somebody there, so I guess you'll get the person with the microphone can get the easiest one within reach.
Thank you very much for your talk. It was really, really interesting. I guess a lot about by its nature, refugee issues are sort of acts of international relations to some degree, and they rely on governments to do certain things, which obviously, as you've identified, aren't really being done. What's available? Is there anything available to individuals to try and affect the kinds of change that we need?
Let me take maybe a couple questions and make sure I come back to yours if it doesn't get lost in the shuffle.
Thanks so much for your talk. I'm interested to know your thoughts on why there hasn't been a multilateral approach, because if you think about the issue of climate change, states have come together and said, right, we're going to sign this agreement and we're going to have targets and do our fair share. So I'm wondering why that hasn't happened and whether it could.
Okay. Well, let me take those two questions because they're both quite good and difficult ones to answer, really. So the first question about what individuals can do, I mean, certainly those people that I saw today that were marching in the street, they're doing something. The groups that are trying to help get people that have been stuck on Manus and Nauru, that kind of advocacy, that kind of work and support for those people who have been brought here. The medical cases that have been evacuated, to try to provide support for them because their status is actually quite precarious as well. They're supposed to all go back, actually, and many of them are being held, as I understand it, under guard basically at hospitals and so on and so forth. So I think there's a great deal of advocacy that you can do here for, it's a relatively small group. It's been, 3,000 people total, I think. But nevertheless, I think very, very important and symbolic of where, not just symbolic, but real people of where things stand in this country. But there have been some other very interesting what are called private sector initiatives. Some of you may be familiar with Chobani Yogurt. There's the fellow that founded it. It's named Hamdi Ulukaya, who himself is a Kurdish, not exactly a refugee, but basically one step ahead of the police as he came to the United States with basically the shirt on his back and a recipe for yogurt, which he had the foresight to call Greek yogurt rather than Turkish or Kurdish yogurt, and marketing worked well, and he's a billionaire. But what he's done is basically pledged half of his wealth, $500 million to help refugees, and he's put it specifically into a challenge to other entrepreneurs to try to basically work the private sector to create jobs, factories, outside of the Zatari refugee camp in Jordan, for example, that will employ local people and employ refugees as well, and do private initiative. In Canada, there are groups of people, I think 6 or more people can come together and privately sponsor a refugee as part of their resettlement system. So there's government sponsorship, but then there's private sponsorship as well. And of course, working hands-on with asylees, people who have been granted asylum, the inshore, I think you call it here, or the offshore resettlement. It goes back to my point earlier about we need to do a better job of integrating refugees. If you're afraid that a child that's resettled here at the age of 3 is going to become a terrorist when they're 28, well, let's reach out to them. Let's help that kid. Let's get them into the kindergarten and invite them to your home and show some kindness. And I can pretty much guarantee you that child then will not become alienated. They may have mental health problems or maybe other issues, but it won't be because they're alienated. And I think that's something that the private sector can do. Multilateral approaches, on paper, it's all there. The Refugee Convention itself actually talks about international solidarity. And there was the New York Declaration in September 2016, which basically said, with kumbaya sort of chords in the background that we're all going to work together. President Obama convened a leaders' summit on the edges of the opening of the General Assembly, September 20th, 2016. And he pledged to increase the number of refugees that the U.S. would resettle from 85,000 to 110,000, and he urged other countries to do the same. It was a great moment until November 6th, 2016, when Donald Trump was elected president, as a reaction to Obama having said, you know, we're going to take more refugees. And he basically scapegoated refugees and fear-mongered refugees in a way that I think actually turned the election. And even though all the things that Obama said about multilateralism and having international support to the countries of first arrival, which is actually part of the Leaders' Summit as well, turned, you know, to dust, basically, as a result of that election. And you mentioned the climate change multilateral accords, well, that happened as well. This year, as a follow-on from the New York Declaration, we have the Refugee Compact, and we have a compact on safe, regular, orderly migration. The United States has basically opted out of both of those, and without U.S. leadership. And by the way, in resettlement, it went from a ceiling, which was filled, of 85,000 in 2016. The ceiling for this year, the current year that just started, the fiscal year that just started on October 1st, is 30,000. And last year, with a 45,000 ceiling, only 22,000 were actually admitted. So the country, the United States, that has resettled more refugees than all the other countries of the world combined, has really turned its back on refugee resettlement, and particularly turned its back on refugees that are Muslim, let's put it that way. It's not just from the Middle East, it's from Somalia, it's other places. The only group of refugees that has had increased admissions since the Trump administration has been Ukrainian Christians. Think about it. Okay, more questions? With 5.5 minutes to go. There was one in the front row. I don't know if you still have a question now, or...
Thank you to the Wheeler Centre and you for your talk tonight. Look, I'm one of those people who supports an orderly refugee intake, and I don't support people just showing up demanding to be let in. Can you suggest a figure that Australia should be required to take, and we can shut up and like it?
No, I can't, and let me explain why I can't do that. Asylum seekers are people who, as I mentioned, are fleeing threats to their lives, or fleeing chaos, and they cross a border and they ask for protection. And there is a legal obligation on those states that have custody of those people, and that includes going out onto the high seas with your naval boats or your Coast Guard or what have you. Your responsibilities, extend in that regard to people that you control and you have custody over, that you can't send them back to a place where they would be persecuted without examining the claim. And I'm not meaning to suggest, and I hope no one in this room comes away with the idea that I'm saying that every asylum seeker is a refugee. I'm not saying that at all. But you do need to do due diligence to examine those claims. You can do it efficiently, you can do it quickly, but you need to do it fairly, and listen to them and give them an opportunity to make the claim. If they don't meet the standard that you've set, and I might prefer a more generous standard. The refugee definition, as I say, is a very narrow one and somewhat antiquated one. But if that's the definition you use, then apply it, and apply it fairly. And if a person doesn't meet that standard, deportation per se, that's not a human rights violation. Human Rights Watch is not going to, protest or give you a hard time over a proper deportation. What we are going to protest is if you haven't done your due diligence and you haven't given fair examination of that claim ahead of time. Now, the reason I couldn't answer your question is because you can't predict how many people might show up at your border. You might be lucky. You might actually be surrounded by water, and it's not that easy to get here. You're somewhat remote, and so the numbers may be pretty manageable and pretty small. You're not Lebanon that has 1 million Syrian refugees coming in, and you're not Bangladesh that has 700,000 that come in over a period of weeks. Thank your lucky stars for geography, all right? So you do have capacity. You can manage this, and it is, frankly, a legal obligation. Now, the other question is the discretionary one, and it's basically how generous are you feeling? You know, do you invite more refugees in? I can't tell you a number. I can't dictate to you, to Australia, what that number ought to be. I can protest and I can be out in the streets in my country saying that 30,000 is way too little for the United States, but I'm not going to, you know, pretend to make that judgment for you. And it's not part of my job. I work for a human rights organization. As I said before, resettlement is not a human right. It's a political decision. You can weigh, you know, the economics and humanitarian considerations and whatever else you want to put into the mix, because it is ultimately a political decision. How generous do you want to be? I see another hand, I think.
Thank you so much for your presentation, for your work. I really commend you and Human Rights Watch, especially for maintaining the emotional and mental fortitude to do this kind of work. I know there's a lot of people that are really overwhelmed by this issue and feel quite distressed and depressed at the same time. I'm wondering if you can give us an example of a country or a jurisdiction that is leading in this area. Perhaps it could serve as a model for other countries or for best practice moving forward.
It's a, excuse me, it's a little hard to come up with one. Canada, of course, does come to mind. Canada, like Australia, has the luck of geography on its side. You know, you've got the Arctic Circle, and you've got water barriers, and you've got the United States, which may be creating refugees, and who knows. But putting that aside, you know, it's insulated. In many respects. And yet, despite that insulation, it's reached out and decided to be generous. And to say, basically at a time when the United States was saying, we're not going to, the 7 days after Trump was elected president, he put in the executive order on the Muslim ban. And that was not just a ban on those 7 countries, it actually suspended the refugee resettlement program entirely for a 90-day period. And it said indefinitely, suspension of any resettlement of any Syrian refugees whatsoever. And Justin Trudeau, at that point, basically said, we'll take 25,000 Syrian refugees, and we can do it, you know, in a matter of months. And did. And I mentioned before the private sponsorship. That's a Canadian initiative of people that basically say, we'll get together, our community group, we'll get together, our church or group or whatever, and we'll sponsor refugees and we'll reach out to them. We will help to integrate them. We'll commit to doing that so they aren't alienated and they are feeling part of our society. And I think that, that Australia could easily do the same thing that Canada's doing with very similar sets of circumstances. Time is up. So I'd be happy to chat with people informally. Feel free to come up, and I'll can keep the conversation going. I'm just enormously gratified to see a full room of people here, to see your interest, and the interest of the people out on the streets as well today. Thank you so much, everyone.
Visit wheelercentre.com for the best in books, writing and ideas from Melbourne, Australia and the world.